People talk about Pharisees a lot, especially when you read the Bible. You hear about them. And mostly, what you hear isn't good. They often show up as the bad guys, the ones Jesus argued with. They seem like the religious police, always looking for problems, always judgmental. But was that really all they were? Were they all just plain bad people? It's easy to think that way, but history and the Bible itself actually paint a more complicated picture. It's worth taking a closer look. To really get what a Pharisee was, we need to go back in time. We're talking about a very specific period in Jewish history. This was during what scholars call the Second Temple period. It was after the Jewish people had come back from exile in Babylon and rebuilt their temple in Jerusalem. But it was before and during the time of Jesus. This was a time when the land of Israel was often ruled by outside powers. By the time Jesus arrived, the Romans were in charge. They had a heavy hand. Life for Jewish people back then was complicated. They were trying to hold on to their faith, their identity, and their traditions, all while living under foreign rule. There were different groups of Jewish people, and they all had different ideas about how to best do that. You had the Sadducees, for instance. They were mostly the wealthy priests and aristocrats. They were connected to the temple, and they mostly accepted only the written law of Moses. They didn't believe in things like the resurrection of the dead or angels. They were often quite practical, maybe even a bit too cozy with the Roman rulers, because it kept their power and position safe. Then there were groups like the Essenes. They were sort of like monks. They lived apart from society, often in desert communities. They thought the temple system was corrupt, and they focused on ritual purity and waiting for God to set things right. The Dead Sea Scrolls likely came from a group like the Essenes, and then there were the Zealots. They were basically freedom fighters. They wanted to kick the Romans out by force. They were fiercely independent and very nationalistic. But our focus is the Pharisees, and they were different from all these other groups. The name Pharisee itself gives us a clue. It comes from a Hebrew word parashim, which means separated ones. But separated from what? Some scholars think it meant they separated themselves from ritual impurity, from people who didn't follow the law strictly enough. Others think it meant they separated themselves to study the law. Either way, it points to a deep commitment to their faith and its rules. The Pharisees really grew out of a movement that started a couple of centuries before Jesus. This was during a time when Greek rulers were trying to force Greek culture and religion on the Jewish people. Many Jews resisted this strongly, fighting for their right to practice their own faith. The Maccabean Revolt is a famous example. From this resistance movement came groups of people who were passionate about the law of Moses. They were determined that Judaism would not disappear. They wanted to make sure God's commands were followed by everyone, not just priests. So, what did the Pharisees believe, and what did they actually do? Their main thing was the Torah, the law of Moses. They loved it. They studied it deeply. They believed it was God's word, and that following it was the way to live a life pleasing to God. But here's where they differed from, say, the Sadducees. The Pharisees believed in both the written Torah, the first 5 books of the Bible, and an oral Torah. What was this oral Torah? Think of it like this. The written law gave general commands. Remember the Sabbath day, to keep it holy. But how exactly do you do that in every situation? What's allowed and not allowed? What if someone's ox falls into a ditch on the Sabbath? Do you pull it out? The written law didn't spell out every single detail, so over generations, wise teachers and scholars discussed these things. They came up with interpretations, traditions, and specific rules to apply the law to daily life. This collection of interpretations and applications became what they called the Oral Torah, or the tradition of the elders. The Pharisees believed this oral Torah was just as binding as the written law. They believed it had been handed down from Moses himself, alongside the written law, to help people understand and fulfill God's commands more completely. They saw it as building a fence around the Torah, adding extra rules to make sure people didn't accidentally break the main ones. This commitment to the law, both written and oral, meant a lot of things for their daily lives. They focused heavily on ritual purity. In the Old Testament, many purity laws applied mainly to priests, especially when they were serving in the temple. But the Pharisees believed that all Jewish people should strive for a high level of purity, almost like priests in their everyday lives. This meant paying close attention to things like washing hands before meals, avoiding certain foods, and being careful about who they associated with. They wanted to make their homes and their meals as holy as the temple itself. They also believed in things that the Sadducees rejected. They believed in the resurrection of the dead, that there would be a life after this one where people would be raised up. They believed in angels and spirits. They also had a view of God's plan and human choice. They believed God had a plan for the world divine providence, but that people still had free will and were responsible for their choices. Another big deal for Pharisees was the synagogue. While the Sadducees focused on the temple in Jerusalem, the Pharisees helped make the synagogue the center of Jewish life everywhere. Synagogues were places of prayer, study, and community. This was hugely important because it meant Jewish faith wasn't just tied to one physical building far away in Jerusalem. It could be practiced, learned, and lived out in every town and village. This made Judaism much more accessible to the common person. It democratized religion, you could say. It wasn't just for priests. Pharisees were also known for their practices of fasting, prayer, and giving to the poor, almsgiving. These were spiritual disciplines they took very seriously. They studied the scriptures diligently. They taught the people. Many of them were scribes, experts in the law, teachers who interpreted and applied the scriptures. They were respected scholars and leaders in their communities. So, when Jesus came along, it's not surprising that he often crossed paths with the Pharisees. They were the most prominent religious group among the common people. They were passionate about God's law, just like Jesus was. But their interpretations and applications were very different from his. One of the main areas of conflict was this Oral Torah, or tradition of the elders. Jesus didn't reject the written law of Moses. He said he came not to abolish the law, but to fulfill it. He affirmed the core commands. But he often challenged the Pharisees' human tradition. In Mark 7, for instance, Jesus criticizes them for prioritizing their traditions over God's actual command. He says they set aside the commands of God to hold to human traditions. He gives the example of Korban, where someone could dedicate their money to God, meaning they couldn't use it to help their needy parents, even though God commanded them to honor their parents. Jesus saw this as a way around God's clear intention. The Sabbath was another huge point of contention. The Pharisees had many detailed rules about what was allowed and not allowed on the Sabbath. They saw Jesus and his disciples breaking these rules. His disciples picked grain to eat on the Sabbath. Jesus healed people on the Sabbath. From the Pharisees' perspective, this was clearly against God's law. But Jesus pointed out that the Sabbath was made for people, not people for the Sabbath. He emphasized that doing good, like healing, was always permissible. He was pointing to the spirit of the law, not just the letter of their interpretation. Purity laws were also a big deal. The Pharisees were very particular about ritual washing, especially before meals. They're bothered when Jesus and his disciples didn't follow these traditions. But Jesus said it's not what goes into a person that makes them unclean, but what comes out of them, their thoughts, their intentions, their heart. He was challenging their focus on outward ritual purity versus inward moral purity. He ate with tax collectors and sinners, people the Pharisees carefully avoided because they were considered ritually unclean or morally corrupt. Jesus welcomed them, showing compassion, and this deeply offended the Pharisees. Perhaps the biggest criticism Jesus had for the Pharisees was about hypocrisy. He called them whitewashed tombs, beautiful on the outside, but full of dead men's bones and uncleanness on the inside. He said they did their religious acts praying, fasting, giving alms to be seen by others, to get praise from people, rather than out of genuine devotion to God. He criticized them for placing heavy burdens of rules on others, but not lifting a finger to help carry those burdens themselves. He saw their hearts as being far from God, even while their outward actions looked righteous. Matthew 23 is a strong chapter where Jesus really lays into them for their pride, their love of honor, and their legalism. Jesus also spoke with an authority that was different from theirs. The scribes and Pharisees taught based on the authority of past rabbis and interpretations. Jesus simply said, "But I say to you." He spoke as one who had direct authority from God, which was very challenging to their system. So, yes, the Gospels definitely portray the Pharisees in a negative light, often as the opponents of Jesus. And this portrayal has shaped how many Christians think of them even today. It's easy to conclude from reading the Gospels that all Pharisees were simply bad people, hypocrites, blind guides. But is that the whole story? Were they all bad? No, not really. First, we have to remember the context of the Gospel. They were written by early Christians who wanted to explain who Jesus was and why he was important. They were also trying to show why Judaism, as practiced by some of its leaders, rejected Jesus. So the Gospels often highlight the clashes and the criticisms. They are theological documents, not just historical reports. They show Jesus as challenging the religious establishment of his day, and the Pharisees were a big part of that establishment. Second, it's a mistake to think of the Pharisees as a single, unified block. Any large group of people, there was diversity among them. There were different schools of thought, like the school of Hillel, which was generally more lenient in its interpretations, and the school of Shammai, which was generally more strict. It's likely there were sincere, devout Pharisees and also prideful, hypocritical ones, just as there are sincere and hypocritical people in any religious group today. Let's look at some examples from the Bible itself that show this nuance. Think about Nicodemus. He was a Pharisee. He was a member of the Sanhedrin, the Jewish ruling council. And yet, John 3 tells us he came to Jesus at night seeking to understand his teachings. He recognized that Jesus was a teacher come from God. Later in John 7, when the other Pharisees are trying to arrest Jesus, Nicodemus speaks up, reminding them that their law requires hearing a person first before judging them. And finally, after Jesus' crucifixion, John 19 tells us that Nicodemus, along with Joseph of Arimathea, helped prepare Jesus' body for burial. These were acts of courage and respect. Nicodemus was clearly a Pharisee who was open to Jesus and who showed genuine compassion and integrity. He wasn't bad. Then there's Gamaliel. He was a respected Pharisee and a famous teacher of the law. In the book of Acts, when the apostles were arrested and brought before the Sanhedrin, Gamaliel steps forward. He advises the council to be cautious. He says, if this plan or this undertaking is of human origin, it will fail, but if it is of God, you will not be able to overthrow them. In that case, you may even be found fighting against God. Acts chapter 5, verse 38-39. This was a wise, measured response, showing a depth of faith and trust in God's ultimate control. He prevented the apostles from being killed. He certainly wasn't bad. And what about Paul? Before his conversion to Christianity, he was known as Saul, and he describes himself as a Pharisee, son of Pharisees, as to the law, a Pharisee as to zeal, a persecutor of the church, as to righteousness under the law, blameless. His commitment to the law was total. He was sincere in his beliefs, even if those beliefs led him to persecute early Christians. He wasn't a hypocrite in the sense of not believing what he preached. He was intensely dedicated. His later conversion shows how a deeply committed Pharisee could eventually embrace Jesus. This tells us a lot about the sincerity and intensity that could exist within Pharisaism. The book of Acts also mentions other Pharisees who became believers in Jesus. Acts 15 tells about a debate among early Christians about whether Gentile converts needed to be circumcised and follow the Mosaic law. Some of the people who argued strongly for this were described as some believers who belonged to the party of the Pharisees. This shows that even after Jesus' resurrection and the beginning of the church, there were Pharisees who followed Jesus. They might have held on to some of their Pharisaic interpretations, but they were still followers of Jesus. So when Jesus criticized the Pharisees, it wasn't necessarily a blanket condemnation of every single Pharisee as inherently evil. Rather, his criticisms were often directed at specific attitudes and behaviors: pride, legalism, hypocrisy, a focus on outward show over inward devotion, and a rigid adherence to human traditions that overshadowed God's true commands. He was calling them, and all of us, to a deeper, more authentic faith, one focused on the heart and on love for God and neighbor. In many ways, Jesus was operating within Judaism, challenging his own people to live out their faith more fully. He shared many beliefs with the Pharisees, like the resurrection, the existence of angels, and the importance of God's law. His argument was often with their interpretation and application of the law, not the law itself. The Pharisees actually played a crucial role in the survival and development of Judaism. After the Romans destroyed the Second Temple in 70 AD, the Sadducees, whose power was tied to the temple, largely disappeared. The Zealots were crushed in the revolt. The Essenes, with their isolated communities, faded away. It was the Pharisees who were left. They had already laid the groundwork for a Judaism that could thrive without the temple. Their focus on the synagogue, on study, on prayer, and on applying the law to everyday life became the foundation for what is known as Rabbinic Judaism. This is the Judaism that developed over the next centuries and is essentially the foundation of modern Judaism today. The oral law, which the Pharisees championed, continued to be developed and eventually was written down in the Mishnah and the Talmud, which are central texts in Judaism. Without the Pharisees, Jewish religious life might not have survived the destruction of the temple. Their emphasis on personal piety, on the importance of every Jew studying the Torah, and on community prayer and learning ensured that Judaism continued. They preserved and adapted the faith for a new era. They kept the flame of Jewish identity burning through centuries of challenge and dispersion. So, looking back, we can see that the Pharisees were a complex group of people. They were deeply committed to God and his law. They valued education and study immensely. They worked hard to make God's commands relevant and applicable to the lives of ordinary people, not just priests. They helped democratize religious practice. These are all good things. But they also had their human flaws. Their zeal for the law could sometimes lead to rigid legalism, where the rules became more important than the people the rules were meant to serve. Their desire for righteousness could sometimes turn into pride and self-righteousness, causing them to look down on others. Their focus on outward observance could, for some, mask a lack of inner change or genuine compassion. And yes, some of them were undoubtedly hypocritical, doing good deeds for show, just as Jesus accused. So, were they all bad? No, that's too simple an answer. They were human beings, just like us. They were sincere in their faith, at least many of them were. They were trying their best to serve God in their context. But they also faced the universal human temptations of pride, judgmentalism, and losing sight of the heart of the matter. Jesus' criticisms were not about their desire to follow God, but about how they sometimes missed the spirit of God's law in their pursuit of the letter. He challenged them, and through them challenges all of us to examine our own hearts, our own motivations, and to ensure our religious practices are rooted in genuine love and humility, not just outward show. They leave us with a powerful reminder that true faith isn't just about knowing and following rules, but about having a heart transformed by God's love and extending that love to others. And they also remind us that religious groups, even those presented as villains in certain narratives, often have a much richer, more nuanced history and legacy than a simple label suggests. They were a hugely important part of religious history, and their influence continues to be felt today.